Scripture shapes the lives of billions of people around the world. Yet scriptures, both the Bible and the Quran, only gain meaning when they are interpreted by the human mind. Minding Scripture, a podcast from the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, explores the meeting of reason with the scriptures of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I am Gabriel Said Reynolds, Professor of Islamic Studies and Theology in the World Religions, World Church program at Notre Dame. Joining me are Professor Francesca Murphy. Welcome.
Hi.
Professor Tzvi Novick.
Good morning.
We are delighted to welcome Professor Nathan Eubank, Associate Professor of New Testament in the Department of Theology at Notre Dame and the author of Wages of Cross-Bearing and Debt of Sin, The Economy of Heaven in Matthew's Gospel, which is published by De Gruyter in 2013. Professor Eubank's research centers on the Synoptic Gospels and Paul, as well as ancient biblical interpretation. He is currently working on merit in early Christianity and its role in the construction of Christian origins. Welcome, Nathan.
Thanks for having me.
Minding Scripture brings together the life of the mind with a life of faith, and to that end, we are delighted today to explore the importance of critical scholarship on the Bible. How has scholarship on both the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and the New Testament changed through the years? What are the major questions that shape biblical scholarship today? These are some of the questions which Francesca and I will be discussing with our Bible scholars, Tzvi and Nathan. And I think Francesca is going to start us off.
Yes, I'm very interested in this question of whether there is progress in historical criticism. And I'll tell you the background to my interest. As an undergraduate at Manchester in the 70s, I must have taken 6-7 courses in Old Testament and New Testament. And, for example, we studied the documentary Hypothesis, and I colored it into Genesis. My Bible still has colored blocks showing JDP, and the same for New Testament criticism. I thought there were some things which we'd learned. I thought all of this was settled science. So then I go away and I do my PhD, which is in systematic theology. So I'm not hearing anything about historical criticism for maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Then I come back, I start teaching, and I learn that things are changing. And all kinds of things that I thought were settled science were being questioned. And this sort of shocked me. And this has gone on over the years. And just recently in one of our seminars on scriptural reasoning, I mentioned that the idea of the resurrection of the body or the afterlife is late within Judaism. And Tzvi said, well, not necessarily. And I thought, oh, we have to discuss this question because, in the way I was taught it, there was a definite, there was an evolution of this idea where first you had a little bit of an idea of a soul, and then later you got a slightly more firm, I know my Redeemer liveth in Job and so on. And so there's a definite evolution of the idea of the afterlife within Judaism in Hebrew Bible over 1,000 years. And the idea that this evolution could even be questioned, it shakes me to the core. And so I wanted to talk about that in this podcast. And I thought we should begin by saying, well, what is historical criticism? If we're going to talk about whether there's progress in historical criticism, whether there's anything such as settled science in historical criticism, we should first of all say, what is it? Which century did it begin in? What are the main names? Who are the main people? Did Hebrew Bible criticism start first and then New Testament? Or how did it all come about? So maybe Tzvi first and then Nathan. Tell me, how did it all come about?
Sure. There's a lot to say, I suppose, with respect to the background to your question. And I guess part of the answer to that would be to think comparatively about historical criticism as a method in comparison with other areas of inquiry. I might say scientific inquiry, but the whole question of to what extent historical criticism is scientific is itself an interesting question. But as to the narrower question of of what historical criticism is and how it develops, I suppose I would define historical criticism as an approach to the study of the Bible that attends to the fact that books of the Bible were produced in specific historical contexts, and this makes a difference for the meaning of the Bible. The audience for whom the Bible was written knew things. The producers of the Bible could assume knowledge by that audience that the current readership of the Bible doesn't possess because of changed circumstances. So, I mean, if we define historical criticism in that way, or even more generally as the inquiry into where do these texts come from, who wrote them, under what circumstances, then you can think of historical criticism as having very deep roots. I mean, in a certain respect, historical criticism begins in the Bible itself, when, for example, the Bible is suggesting that the Song of the Sea was sung by Moses at the splitting of the sea. That's kind of an attempt to situate a traditional poem that doesn't assert itself as having been written by Moses and give it an historical location.
This is Exodus 15 or
This is Exodus
16?
15. That's
15.
right. Yeah. So, or the idea of specific psalms having been recited by David under specific circumstances. There's a kind of arguably an historical framing there, or an attempt to locate these texts in specific circumstances. In the medieval period, also numerous medieval Jewish exegetes, for example, are attentive to the fact that there are kind of sort of references in the Bible that are unintelligible to us, but the Bible seems to assume that they would have been understood by their audience. So, for example, Aaron, the high priest, right? It says that his son marries from the daughters of this man named Putiel, someone whom we have no idea. The Bible makes no reference to this person otherwise, but the fact that the Bible bothers to mention it suggests that the audience of this text was aware of this person and he had some kind of reputation. And so medieval commentators will note, well, he must have been some famous person in his day, and we don't know about him. And that in itself, there is an historian's attitude over there. And you find those sorts of observations kind of throughout medieval Jewish exegesis.
Can I
Yeah,
interrupt
sure.
just to ask, I mean, does this mean you're locating the roots of historical critical scholarship within the tradition and not as a response to certain things, say, going on in the 19th century? You see it as an organic development.
Well, I wouldn't say that there's an organic development between this sort of inner biblical or medieval exegesis on the one hand and the sort of developments that occur in the 19th century. I think
What
it's
are
probably
those developments that occur
yeah,
in the
yeah,
18th and
right,
19th
yeah.
century?
So yeah, those are I think are somewhat different. But on the other hand, kind of it's helpful to realize to appreciate the continuity. But in the 19th century, well, really even before the 19th century, Spinoza is a very, very important figure here already in the 17th century.
And he was Jewish, wasn't he?
Spinoza is Jewish, though with a very interesting background. His family is a Marrano family, so having converted under compulsion to Christianity in Spain, and then having later moved to Amsterdam, where they were free to practice their religion. And it's long been thought that this sort of background, this Marrano background of having converted under compulsion to Christianity and then living as Christian publicly, but as Jewish or resistant in any case privately, leads to a kind of free thinking, a kind of freedom from tradition. Because when they return to the Jewish fold, they do so having formed their Jewish thinking independent from a Jewish community. And so you see sort of a free thinking emerging in that context. Spinoza, in any case, certainly was quite bold in his thinking, and he posited that much of the Pentateuch couldn't have been written by Moses. It's not such a bold idea when you think about it. I mean, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses in tradition, don't actually attribute their authorship to Moses. They speak of Moses in the third person. Moses dies before the Pentateuch is over. And so it's not so bold an idea when you think about it, but for traditional Jews, certainly, and then more broadly, traditional Christians, this was a bold idea. So one could think of him as a major early figure in modern historical criticism. And then after that, you get to kind of other major figures in the 18th and 19th centuries. Jean Astruc in France, Julius Wellhausen is an important name in Germany in the 19th century. And then you get modern historical criticism as we know it with these names in the 18th and 19th centuries.
So what comes about then in the late 18th, early 19th century is what you could call an exclusively historical criticism. That's what's new about it, is that it's exclusively historical.
When you say exclusively historical, what do you mean by that? To the
It
exclusion of
claims
what?
to be exclusively historical.
With no
I mean,
theological
without an attempt at
Exactly,
tradition, right?
exactly.
Right.
Outside
Uh-huh.
of tradition and theology. it's exclusively historical
Yeah, I
criticism. Is
mean,
that
I'd
the
be
idea?
curious to hear kind of Nathan's views on this, but I would say that these figures, as certainly someone like Spinoza and Jean Astruc, who kind of first develops this idea of distinct sources, say in the Pentateuch, that have been wound together and can in principle be unwound, are certainly very theologically inclined, and in part doing their work to defend against more radical views. So the relationship between historical criticism and faith in this period, I think, is a complicated question, and I think it's fair to say that for the most part, we're not dealing with secularizing radicals in this early period.
Yeah, that's right. In the early modern period, the relationship between history and theology becomes fraught in a way that it wasn't, say, to use an ancient Christian example, Augustine, who said that, it's very important that one interprets a saying in light of its context and the culture, and you should know the language, and you should compare manuscripts to make sure you have the right reading. And that sort of work was either done, or at least the importance of it was acknowledged for centuries. But what starts to happen, I think, in the early modern period is it became apparent to some people that history might impinge on theology or might limit what theologians are able to do. But it certainly isn't the case that the historical critics were simply anti theological. So, to give two examples before we get to the 19th century, Richard Simon, an Oratorian priest, a French priest, is sometimes called the father of historical criticism, which probably isn't quite accurate. But he thought that digging into the historical study of the Old and New Testaments was a way of refuting Protestant emphasis on the Bible alone. He said, you look closely at this historically, and it falls apart.
You need tradition.
You need a
You need,
tradition,
yeah,
right? And
right.
he wasn't exactly thanked for his efforts by other Catholics, including the Oratorians. So quite how this all sifts out was disputed. At the same time, you already have, say, in the 18th century, English deists who seized on these methods, sharpened by the Renaissance, sharpened by classical study. So we're going to read the Bible the same way that we read anything else, Homer or Plato or whatever. And they use these tools to try to offer kind of radically revisionist accounts of Christian origins, of sacred history. And so it could go both ways. It continues into the 19th century when, in Germany especially, the historical critical paradigm starts to reign supreme in the universities. And you have some people saying it's necessary to do the historical work first so we can understand what the Bible really says, and then you can build your dogma off of that.
So, just to sorry to jump in, but I mean, it sounds like the beginnings are pretty chaotic, and that's the word that comes to mind because you have you have believers. I mean, the case of Spinoza sounds like basically a believer, and the case of the French priest you mentioned.
Richard Simon.
Yeah, thank you. And but then you have people coming outside of sort of the community, and so it's not like there's an organized effort by a community of faith that says, "Well, let's move forward with this sort of scholarship because it can enrich in our life of faith," or something. It sounds a little chaotic.
Very chaotic, and it happens in fits and starts. For example, on the Catholic side, when you get into the 19th and early 20th century, there were many scholars who were strong believers who thought that their work was there to build up the church, who were silenced. If you read the work of Catholic biblical scholars, even in the early 20th century, oftentimes you can find them tiptoeing around certain issues because they'd been told that certain conclusions, such as that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, were ruled out of bounds. And so it's always been there's been a difficult give and take. And I think people in religious communities who are not themselves historical critics, many have always been unconvinced of the value, I think.
Right, and it's also, I think, very tempting to take a position on the findings and methods of historical criticism that are somewhat opportunistic. So I think, for example, of the discovery in the Near East in the 19th century of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the discovery that there is evidence of a flood narrative beyond the Bible, and this can be welcomed by believers as a confirmation of the truth of the Bible. On the other hand, when one digs down into the implications of this, and more generally into the kind of the methods that inform a kind of a comparison or a situating of the Bible in its ancient Near Eastern context, you get a much more complicated portrait. And so, sorting out to what extent this method and these findings challenge faith, to what extent they confirm it, was and is a complicated question.
Some historical critics have managed to work out an implicit philosophy or even metaphysic, the relationship between God and creation from historical criticism, and have thought that the day-to-day work of historians necessarily excludes God. I mean, a famous example of this is Ernst Troeltsch's essay on the distinction between historical and theological method. And he said, "Look, if we read the Bible like anything else, we read it like any other text, the way that we're reading it necessarily cuts God out of the events of human history. That's just the way that we work. And so to be consistent, you need to leave God out of things completely." And so, I mean, that's an example of somebody taking the same task with other people around him in the same time and place thought that they were doing God's work. For Trelch, he could push it in a very kind of radical direction.
So those are methodologies. I mean, that's not part of, like, the content of historical criticism, that's part of the methodology of one historical critic.
Well, I mean, Trelch thinks that any honest historical critic should come to the same conclusion that he does.
Right. Many scholars have felt that way. Should we get on to content maybe a bit?
Second
Yeah,
question.
right. So we have the second question, which leads us more to think about what were the subjects or the particular insights that were developing the thought of biblical scholars in the 19th century. And I think we've brought up two of them that I wonder if you could elaborate on. We'll start maybe with Tzvi. And the first is the question of the documentary hypothesis. We mentioned JEDP, the four supposed sources, I think developed by Wellhausen, but maybe you can correct me on that. So maybe you could touch on that. And then the question of ancient Near East, generally discoveries in the world of Assyriology that somehow have importance for biblical criticism.
Yeah, so as far as the documentary hypothesis is concerned, so this is a hypothesis that's specifically about the Pentateuch. So it's not about the Bible generally, but about the five books of Moses. And Wellhausen kind of formulates a hypothesis, a particular view of the development of the Pentateuch that becomes, to some extent, canonical for a number of decades afterward. But he is doing more of a synthetic work, synthesizing work on sources of the Pentateuch that had already begun more than 100 years before his key work was published in the second half of the 19th century. But basically, as this hypothesis emerges, the claim is that there are distinct tellings of the early history of Israel from the creation of the world to the death of Moses, and there are different groups of Israelites telling the story in somewhat different ways. And then you have the work of a redactor or an editor who's bringing together these sources, or perhaps multiple editors at different points. One brings together a couple of sources, then another one adds another source to produce what we know of as the Pentateuch. And then in its classical form for Wellhausen, we have these four sources, J, E, D, and P, the Yahwist source, J, and E, this Elohist source, that are distinguishable on the basis of the names that they use for God, right? And so this is thought to be a major kind of clue to unlocking the Pentateuch. Why does the Pentateuch use different names for God? Sometimes it refers to God by a generic Elohim, God, and sometimes it uses the proper name of God, the Tetragrammaton, which scholars hypothesize is pronounced Yahweh, and so goes by J, pronounced in German Yah. And then there's a distinct source behind Deuteronomy. And then there are priestly authors who are producing this fourth strand. And so this is this hypothesis in its classical form. It also makes certain assumptions about the order, right? Which one is earlier, which one is later. And there are a lot of theological assumptions encoded into this hypothesis about which are earlier, which are later. And I could get into that if we'd like. But this is all about the Pentateuch. So it's a small part of historical criticism. It does have also very early roots in a certain respect. You have, again, to advert to medieval Jewish exegesis, and this is something that Jewish scholars today looking to try to find a path forward for traditional Jews who both want to accept the authority of the Pentateuch, because the Pentateuch is so central for Judaism as the locus for biblical law. So for traditional Jews who both want to accept the authority of the Pentateuch and to acknowledge the findings of historical criticism, so they do advert to these kind of early traditional kosher medieval exegetes, right? If they believe it, then surely we can, who do suggest or complicate a simple assumption about Mosaic authorship. So I'll just give one example. When Abraham arrives in the land in Genesis 12, The Bible notes that Abraham travels around until Shechem, v'hakna'ani az ba'aretz, and the Canaanites were then in the land. So this is a troubling passage because it implies that the author of the Bible is saying the Canaanites were then in the land, but they're not there now. But if Moses is writing the Bible, why should he be saying the Canaanites were then in the land? The Canaanites were in the land at the time of Moses. And so you have a fantastic creativity devoted to trying to solve this problem. But a medieval exegete, Ibn Ezra, says, of course, this may not be the case, in which case there is a secret here, and the wise person will keep silent. So he's kind of gesturing toward an awareness that the traditional narrative needs to be complicated. So that's one kind of major set of findings, or one major result of early historical criticism, but specifically with respect to the Pentateuch. But then there's a whole world of historical criticism and attentiveness to the Bible as an historical artifact beyond the documentary hypothesis. All of the findings of the ancient Near East that are occurring beginning in the 19th century largely, and then throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, we're constantly uncovering new texts.
Numa Elish was also discovered.
Right. So Gilgamesh, which offers tremendous insight into the earliest chapters of the Bible, Genesis 1 to 11, the kind of prehistory or mythic prehistory, and Numa Elish, which is a Babylonian creation myth that sheds great light on Genesis 1. There are findings from various. I mean, it's innumerable. Really, there isn't a book in the Bible that is not illuminated in the Hebrew Bible that is not illuminated by the findings of the ancient Near East.
I was thinking because of the Ibn Ezra narrative, which it seems he was sort of used as a way of justifying the legitimacy of biblical criticism, saying this is not something totally foreign to the tradition. But I just want to ask then generally about, so what was the social context as scholars were advancing these ideas? Was there a resistance among other scholars from a religious perspective? Were they labeling this as somehow heretical, blasphemous, fundamentally problematic? Maybe Nathan, you could comment on this too for New Testament scholarship otherwise. I mean, was this like a vivid, intense, polemical debate?
Sure. Well, I mean, within the Jewish context, I'd say, I mean, most of this work is occurring, as Nathan had mentioned, kind of in a university context, and in its early stages in the 19th century, Jews are not involved in this to any significant degree, but they are consumers of it, and there is very strong traditionalist opposition, and it's grounded in part in tradition and the commitments of faith. It's also grounded in part in recognition that I think modern scholarship has come to also, that many of the assumptions of historical criticism in the 19th century, really, and beyond, they came with their own assumptions, right? There was a kind of a hope for objectivity, historical objectivity, in approaching these questions, but scholars are people too, and they come with their own theological assumptions. Historical scholarship in the 19th century, many of those assumptions are anti-Semitic assumptions formed by traditional understandings of the New Testament and its reception. So, for example, to get back to Wellhausen, his view was that the last of these four documents that came together to produce the Pentateuch was the priestly source. And in his narrative, you begin with these early sources that have a robust anthropomorphic kind of conception of God, and then it becomes fossilized in the exilic period because he dates this last source, this priestly source, to the exilic period. It becomes fossilized and ritualized in the work of priests who are, in his conception, clearly proto-Pharisees. So he's encoding a kind of assumption about the sort of Judaism and the Jewish context that Jesus emerges in and critiques. He's encoding those assumptions about what Judaism is, fossilized belief system whose end has come, whose time has come, or whose time is over, into his reconstruction of the development of the Pentateuch. And so you get, for example, Solomon Schechter, who is a famous Jewish scholar, very important in the early history of the Cairo Geniza, which is, I suppose, a topic for a different day. But he delivers a famous lecture in the beginning of the 20th century, 1903, I believe, in which he calls higher criticism, that is to say, this methods of biblical criticism that look to the origins of the text. Higher criticism, he says, is simply higher anti-Semitism. So there you have a critique that I think does correctly diagnose the infiltration of certain anti-Semitic premises into the work of some of historical criticism.
Right, and we're not speaking of, maybe the point isn't that Wellhausen was personally anti-Semitic or something like that, but that there are certain biases that come from the position of the background of each individual scholar and maybe the culture of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And this didn't it was a convenient way to dismiss historical criticism or historical attentiveness to the Bible. We don't need to deal with this in the tradition because the people who are doing it are simply motivated by anti-Semitism, and so we shouldn't be allow those kinds of biases to dismiss the project as a whole. But we have to be aware of them.
Right, Nathan, you can add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that on the Christian side, while there's always been pushback from believers from various sorts for understandable reasons, a lot of the new scholarship on Christian origins in 19th century Germany proceeds on the assumption that the Christian movement started with something good and often proto-Protestant, either with Jesus or Paul or both, and then quickly lapsed into a kind of Judaizing mixture of authentic Christian thought with aspects of Judaism and also paganism, and then decline from there. I mean, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that some version of that declension narrative into mixing, say, Pauline theology with Jewishness is ubiquitous in the historiography of early Christianity in the 19th and to some extent in the 20th century as well. So while I mean, I hope we're going to talk about some about the enduring contributions of historical criticism, so it doesn't sound like the whole thing can be dismissed. It can't. I think if you pick up the works of people like F.C. Bauer in the 19th century, the really important people, with this in mind, you won't be disappointed. I mean, this is the kind of the founding myth that drives a lot of the historical study.
Can I push back a little bit? Okay, I just want to push back from the point of view of my undergraduate self, Manchester, 1977. Like, what I took away from JEPD, from the idea of these four sources, was that the Yahwist and the Elohist have a really childish, concrete, anthropomorphic idea of God, and Yahweh closes the door of the ark, you know? Whereas the priestly author, who's supposed to have, say, written a Genesis 1, very nice, low, ritualistic, slow, that he has a more transcendent, distant idea of God. And so as it came into English Bible scholarship, it may have dropped the heavy Protestant anti-Semitism, and it's not all about P is legalistic and Pharisaic. It's just more like P has a transcendent idea of God, and J and E have a more youthful, childlike idea of God.
Mhm. Yeah, right. I mean, even right with respect to this suggestion, right, about the different theologies of the sources, they're not inevitably, I mean, poisoned by by the particular assumptions of certain 19th century scholars. There is a lot to say about the question of whether J is early and all of that.
Of course, because
But
it's
putting
still,
that
it's a,
aside,
why
yeah.
should the anthropomorphic come first?
Right, but yeah, but putting that aside, of course, absolutely. I mean, the findings of historical criticism more generally are absolutely essential to the understanding of the Bible. And as much as things have changed, there are enduring contributions, and it's a robust field.
So we're going to return to these enduring contributions. I think now is a good time to take a break. We're going to move up to the 20th century and maybe even get to the 21st century, which would be great. Now is a good time for you, friends, to think about rating Minding Scripture. You have stars there. I suggest you put down 5, and we'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to Minding Scripture. So, Tzvi, I just want to follow up. We were speaking about the enduring contribution of biblical criticism and making the point that it's not all bad. There is good there. So, just in that regard, what about the two specific ideas we were addressing, contributions of biblical criticism, the first being documentary hypothesis, 4 sources for the Pentateuch, the second being connection to ancient Near East, the contributions of Assyriology. Did these endure, these two ideas? Did they still shape biblical scholarship?
Sure. So on the first documentary hypothesis, the documentary hypothesis in its classical form, these particular four documents, this particular way in which they were combined, that is no longer a reigning hypothesis. There isn't the same sort of consensus, but there is consensus that the Pentateuch has complicated origins, and I'd say there is a consensus about a certain kind of documentary hypothesis, namely a distinction between priestly material and non-priestly material. That seems to be a part of the hypothesis that really does hold up, and there's a fundamental distinction between these two different groups of texts. How to further divide the material, how to date the material, that is a question. There are neo-documentarians that offer something like the classical hypothesis, albeit with a different set of assumptions about the order in which they were produced. But even alongside that, beyond the neo-documentarians, who are a relatively small group, there is a pretty strong consensus, I would say, about this insight, a distinction between priestly and non-priestly. As for the ancient Near East, I think the importance of the ancient Near East for understanding the Bible has only increased as new texts have been uncovered after the original discoveries in Iraq. There are many other discoveries at other sites. And Ugarit, for example, right along the Mediterranean, is a tremendously important site for understanding the Bible and the theological questions about the relationship between Yahweh and Baal.
Right. Right.
The contributions of the ancient Near East are enduring, and there is no question that one can't understand the Hebrew Bible without a thorough grounding in ancient Near Eastern texts, cultures, languages.
Right. Thank you.
What about the New Testament, Nathan? It's well known that the Life of Jesus movement keeps running into the sand and then starting up again. Right now, we're on about the fourth quest for the historical Jesus. Every time they have one, they give up and then they start again, and they give up and they start again. Do we know more about the historical Jesus now than we did in the 18th century? Do we know more about the composition of the synoptics than John? Do we know more about the Pauline corpus? When I was an undergraduate, we were taught pretty much the old-fashioned, the old Paul, the old look on Paul, where he'd been a terrible, miserable Pharisee and he was struggling to redeem himself. And then he saw the light and he threw away all that Pharisaic garbage. And then, when I returned to teaching biblical studies 10 years later, there was the new look on Paul and Pharisaism was good. And so, are we actually making any progress in this field? Can we date the Gospels? Can we?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one place where we clearly have made progress in the study of Jesus in the Gospels is in taking seriously the Gospels themselves as literature, what kind of literature they are, what kind of historical information we can mine from them, and what their relationship is to each other. So we take it for granted now that, say, between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the so-called synoptic Gospels, there is extensive verbatim agreement in Greek between them. And rather than trying to harmonize the four Gospels into one great meta story, we put them side by side in columns, and you can see that you know people disagree on who's reading whom, but that they are reading each other, and that there's a lot that we can work out about the individual concerns of the different authors. That's usually called source criticism leading to redaction criticism. That's good. I should note that that's not completely new either. I mean, Augustine does something similar to this, so it's a recurring motif in a conversation like this. A lot of what we celebrate as new has actually been around for a long time. We've come to an increased appreciation, especially toward the end of the 19th century, starting, I think, especially with Vreda and his famous book on the Messianic secret. Vreda asks the question, why is Jesus in Mark's gospel telling everybody to shut up all the time? The demons, people he heals, why doesn't he want anybody to talk? I don't know anybody who thinks that Vreda answered that question correctly, but what he did that was really important for the study of Jesus in the Gospels is he said, I don't want to just take the Gospels at face value. I want to know, what did this mean for Mark, for the author, in his historical setting? So scholars have started to look at all four Gospels as windows into the world of their composition, which makes them then a resource for understanding later first century Christianity and then also refines our sense of what we're able to know about Jesus from the Gospels. If you read 19th century, I mean, you could call it historical Jesus scholarship, a lot of it assumes that we can figure out, Jesus's inner psychological progression from one passage to another. Jesus went up on a mountain because something made him sad in the previous passage. And we have an increased sense that the Gospels are not like modern biographies giving us that kind of psychological development. So that's a real advance. I think we have a better sense of the genre of the Gospels and their relationship with each other. With Paul, it's a little bit more difficult. I think there's a famous saying often misattributed to Albert Schweitzer that when one looks at the history of historical Jesus studies, it's like a person looking down a well and seeing his own reflection. So you're describing something else, but you're actually describing yourself. It's actually said by George Terrell, a Catholic.
Modernist.
Yeah, a modernist. Yeah, I think that that's even more true with Pauline studies. A lot of New Testament scholars clearly have more of a vested interest in getting Paul right than they do with getting
Jesus
Jesus
right.
right, which seems strange. But I think it's true. So we have come to, as you said, Francesca, to an increased sense of Paul's Jewishness, that defining Paul as the pure antithesis of what is Jewish, that I think that is a real advance. Something analogous has happened with the study of Jesus. But it's important to point out as we're assessing gains and losses or credits and debts that that's partly just a correction of a problem that was created by historical critics themselves.
Yeah.
So historical critics set up Jesus and Paul as a radical antithesis to Judaism, and then a century later realize they were wrong and congratulate themselves for doing it.
Maybe there's been some overcorrection. I don't know if we want to jump into current debates, but I mean, have we emphasized too much the enduring, continuing Jewishness of the early, that's reflected in the lives of Paul and Jesus?
I feel less confidence in pronouncing on that because we don't have enough distance to talk about it in the same way that we're talking about some of these 19th century developments, because this is still very much in New Testament studies a live debate. I mean, if you look at Jesus, Paul, or the study of individual gospels, for example, like Matthew, many scholars would like to say that Matthew is completely within the world of Judaism. Other people would want to say that we see Matthew and the other gospels moving outside into kind of a different phenomenon. So we don't agree on this. So some scholars would argue that there's an overcorrection. Yeah, I don't think so myself.
What do we know about the historical Bible today that we would not have known if historical criticism had never been invented? About 20 years ago, a guy called Niall Ferguson developed this hypothetical history. It was a big thing. And so I want you to do a kind of like both of you to do a sort of hypothetical historical reconstruction. What would the hypothetical world of scholars not know about the historical Bible, which we do now know if historical criticism had never been invented? So imagine a world in which 18th and 19th century, there's no Spinoza, there's no Wellhausen, for some reason, it just never takes off. And we're in the same world, except for that never happened. Now, what would we not have? Tzvi and Nathan.
It's an interesting question. It would really look quite different. We'd be out of jobs, I suppose.
You would still exist. You and
There
Nathan
would be
would
no
still.
CJA.
Well, for one, our dictionaries would be very impoverished. There are so many biblical words that are unintelligible or have been understood incorrectly because we didn't have the data from Akkadian, from Ugaritic, from these ancient Near Eastern languages that enable us properly to understand them.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but do any examples come to mind of specific words that we relearned maybe in the 19th, 20th century through biblical scholarship?
Sure. Well, there is one of the tribes, one of the 12 tribes of Israel is Zebulun, and his etymology, the etymology that's given for him in the Bible is Leah. She says after his birth that now that Zebulun has been born, he's Beleni Ishi, my husband will zebul me. But what exactly does that mean? You don't really have much in the Bible to go on because that root isn't really used elsewhere, except in our references that don't seem immediately applicable. But in Ugarit, these myths about Baal, the god Baal, who's well known from the Bible, but much enlightened by Ugaritic, he is referred to as Prince Baal. And Zabal, this root, this same sequence of consonants, is used there to describe Baal as a prince. Piecing this together with other data from Akkadian, and then we can appreciate in light of that other words in the Bible that are connected to it, but which we wouldn't have known without this data. We can understand that this root means to exalt, to lift up, to raise up, so that Baal as prince is exalted. And so that's just one example. I mean, there are endless examples. So I'd say one big difference, and that is the work of Moshe Held, who's a great Semitist, student of Semitic languages, who pieced together that relationship between these roots.
Are you saying, going from what you said overall, are you saying that we wouldn't have the big theories and the meta narratives, but we would have the philology and the study of languages?
No, my point is that beyond the big theories that we've been speaking about, how
Yes.
the Pentateuch came about, what is an awareness that this flood narrative that's in the Bible is not just the Bible's, but it's the Bible's take on a more general mythic motif, or that the account of Eden is again the Bible's take on a set of possibilities for narrating the early history of human beings that we find elsewhere in the ancient Near East. Beyond those very fundamental questions, the very meaning of words,
Yes.
many
Yes.
words, would not be possible without the contributions of historical criticism. So yeah, I'm looking at that as one enduring contribution of historical criticism. And in a world without historical criticism, we'd be fumbling about in the dark when it comes to a lot of words in the Bible. So simply at the purely etymological level, the kind of dictionary that we can produce, a modern dictionary of biblical Hebrew, will make reference to words in Akkadian or Ugaritic, many times in any page. So that's one enduring difference. I'd note another way in which our understanding of the Bible would be different, and I think, for myself anyhow, impoverished, would be that as much as the documentary hypothesis, say, to come to the Pentateuch in its classical form, is no longer accepted, there is this understanding that the Bible, including the Pentateuch, reads as a single narrative, but if you bore down, you see here conflict, different theological visions coming into a conversation with each other. And so it's a very different, and for me anyhow, in terms of my own kind of theological inclination, a much richer portrait, but in any case, truer to history, a much richer portrait of the development of these basic questions about that the Bible is interested in. Who is God? What is God's relationship with the world? What does it mean for God to be intervening in the world and developing a relationship with Abraham, a covenant? These are all categories, questions that when you read the Bible ahistorically, you get what looks like a single answer on, or at least when it comes to the Pentateuch, you get a single answer on. And historical criticism enables us to appreciate that what you can really find is a whole symphony of competing, discussing, debating voices.
And Nathan, the same question. In a world in which historical criticism had not come about, what would New Testament scholarship be lacking? Or how would we know less about the New Testament if we'd had no form criticism, none of this?
I think something analogous to what Tzvi just said about the Hebrew Bible would be true. We would have a much poorer sense of the world of the New Testament texts. We'd have a much poorer sense of the world of first century Judaism, out of which the New Testament texts come, even down to something, again, as simple as the meaning of words. One of the easiest places to show the benefits of historical criticism is when it comes to just the addition of new data, new texts, literary texts, non-literary texts, documentary papyri, receipts, contracts, things like that greatly enrich our understanding of the language of the New Testament, which is often written in a Greek that resembles the kind of sort of workaday Greek that you find in that kind of literature. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has greatly advanced our understanding of the Jewishness of many New Testament texts. So, I mean, we would be in big trouble. We've also advanced new techniques, which in some cases just are better. Sometimes combining new data with new techniques. This is easiest to show with New Testament textual criticism, which is sometimes distinguished from historical criticism. That's a little bit artificial. It's really part of the overall process. So, if, for example, if you sit down with a King James Bible, you look at the New Testament and compare it to a modern translation like the NRSV or the NAB, you'll see lots of differences, and that comes from the fact that we do have a much better understanding of the way that the New Testament manuscripts, the way they looked in antiquity, were able to positively identify certain things that are, say, printed in a King James Bible as later accretions, and so that's a significant advance that also then, in turn, aids our theological understanding of individual authors. I mean, to take a very famous example, Mark's gospel famously ends in the oldest and best manuscripts with the women running out from the tomb. They've just been informed that Jesus is risen, though they don't see him, and they're supposed to tell the disciples that he is risen. And they say, and Mark ends by saying, "And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." And of course, people in antiquity found that ending unsatisfactory, and so multiple endings were written and added, and actually one of them is canonical for some Christian groups. But the text critical work that reveals that Mark himself, well, maybe wanted to end there, or maybe was just stopped for some reason, then contributes to our understanding of Mark's own theology, Mark's own way of telling the story. So
He
we'd
just
be
ended abruptly. I do that too. And they just he just liked to end abruptly. I just say the end and that's it.
Well, it is true. You can debate. I mean, there's always the devil's in the details. I mean, many texts in antiquity do end with an abruptness that we would say we would dock our students for if they did. And maybe he just got tired or ran out of money. So you can debate how much to build on that theologically.
So I want to ask about, we spoke about enduring contributions. I want to ask about enduring resistance because we've heard about some ways in which biblical criticism has been a good thing, even at the basic level of understanding vocabulary better, but a richer understanding, for example, of the world of the New Testament. So that's great. And in many ways, biblical criticism informs what we do today, even at a place like Notre Dame. Of course, mining scripture comes from the Department of Theology at Notre Dame. And when we teach in the classroom, when I teach foundations, I introduce students to the documentary hypothesis, although apparently both among Catholics and Jews and others, there was a time where that would not have been cool, right?
That's right.
Would not
Early
have been
20th
okay.
century. Yeah.
So, but now, at Notre Dame, which, we don't only play football, but we also teach theology in the Catholic tradition. That's expected, right? If you said Moses is the author of the Pentateuch, you wouldn't be taken seriously on a scholarly level, I think. But there must still be resistance. And I was thinking, you were speaking about boring down deeper to detect the granular aspects of the biblical text, Tzvi, and then Nathan, you spoke about later accretions in Mark. And I just wondered, there's some people who say that more granular view or that more maybe precise but critical view of Mark, that doesn't actually get us closer to truth. Where does resistance come from in biblical scholarship?
Just to clarify, resistance in biblical scholarship, you mean traditional resistance to biblical scholarship, or is that?
I'm guessing that today there are academic scholars who, for philosophical reasons, object to the usefulness of biblical scholarship and getting closer to truth. And there are perhaps people within believing communities who have more confessional objections. So,
Yeah,
is that
sure.
right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I'd say within scholarship, I mean, within the field of biblical scholarship, say the sorts of people who will end up at the annual gathering of the Society of Biblical Literature, historical criticism as an enterprise is taken for granted, and that there is no opposition to that, and I think for good reason. But there was relatively recently, we had on an earlier podcast, Robert Alter, who just produced a translation of the entire Hebrew Bible. There was a reaction, say, among scholars who were this is in the 70s and 80s, scholars coming from the field of literature who felt that historical criticism, source criticism in particular, had a kind of a tin ear for the literary quality of the Bible and some of the judgments that source critics were making the criteria that they were using failed to account for the quality of the Bible as literature.
Right.
And
And
so
I mean, maybe this is saying the same thing, but I mean, if you keep breaking it apart into smaller original pieces, you just get fragments, right? I mean,
right, and there is a school of Pentateuchal source criticism that uses that terminology of fragments and thinks of the Bible as kind of an agglomeration of fragments, and that can pose a challenge for theology, though to some extent it puts theology or the theological enterprise of making sense of biblical teaching on a different footing. It doesn't preclude it, but it compels one to ask what are the theologies of these different voices? What is the theology of the editor who is or the redactor who is combining them? But then also, of course, whatever the findings of historical criticism, the fact is that for traditional communities, Jews, Christians, the Bible, whatever its origins, does eventually emerge in the form that we know it, or roughly the form that we know it, and then and it's canonical, and it's the foundation for Jewish self-understanding, for Christian self-understanding ever after. Well, while historical criticism is perceived as a threat still in many traditional Jewish communities, the fact is that whatever the results of historical criticism, you still do in the end have a Bible. And for me, for example, as a Jew who kind of conceives of himself as living within a tradition, the Bible as a whole is a theologically significant artifact, the fundamental theologically significant fact, irrespective of the historical background. And so you have, for me anyhow, a theologically richer portrait where you have both these competing voices that are discovered through careful historical criticism, and then you have the Bible as a whole. But there does remain undoubtedly traditional opposition in some circles in more traditional circles, Orthodox circles in particular, to historical criticism. I think that is definitely fair to say.
Though it does also work the other way for some conservative believers, both Jews and Christians, in the sense that you can call it fragments, but another word for fragments is sources.
Hmm.
And if there are no sources, and if the whole Pentateuch, for example, was written by one guy in the post-exilic period with no sources, then it was just made up by one guy. And so you get conservative Jews and Christians arguing and defending sources.
Mm.
I guess, and that must go back to Richard Simon, that actually the existence of sources is better than the existence no sources. And one Jewish Herodotus writing in the post-exilic period means the whole thing is a fake.
Right, and it has been suggested, right, that these that the kind of neo-documentarian source criticism does have the advantage of pushing back against the idea, say, that the entire Pentateuch or much of the Pentateuch was an exilic Persian era phenomenon of the 6th or 5th centuries. Of course, this is to speak of the motivations of scholars, which is a very tricky sort of thing. Ultimately, one hopes the arguments stand on their own and can be evaluated on their own.
so we're running out of time, but I think we maybe can give the last word to Nathan to comment on this question of resistance. Yeah.
For sure. Well, it's understandable that believers and some theologians of my acquaintance would fear or resent historical criticism because you have experts with information that they don't have telling them that things that they thought were true about the Bible weren't exactly true. I think some of the fault for this, at least on the New Testament side, probably lies with historical critics themselves. Biblical scholars often like to play the wet blanket. We like to say, you thought Jesus, he was laid in the manger because there's no room in the inn, but actually there is no inn in Luke 2. That's a true, an accurate example. But also because I think we haven't done quite as good of a job with the actual interpretation of the New Testament text as we have with the world around the New Testament. So while historical criticism is obviously indispensable and has made real gains, not in the sense of inevitable progress toward a shining future, but maybe more like a ratchet effect. Every now and then something clicks over and we can't go back. There's a real gain, like recognizing the Jewishness of Paul, for example. While that has happened, when it comes to, say, understanding a parable of Jesus, It's often, I'm going to say something that I'm sure other people in my field will disagree with. It is not at all apparent to me that if you pick up a book on the parables of Jesus, that you're going to do any better than you would do if you just picked up Origen or Augustine or the medieval gloss tradition on that same parable. It's unfortunate that there are still some theologians who would like to get rid of this whole enterprise. I think it's obviously indispensable, even for just understanding the simple meanings of words. I do understand why some people question exactly what the payoff is, and I think that the onus is on historical critics to do better.
Thank you. So today we've been speaking about the history of biblical criticism and some of the controversies and debates that have unfolded over the past decades and even in the 19th century already. But it sort of leads us to the big question, which is, what have we actually accomplished? Where have we gotten? I mean, what would you say, Nathan, about that? What real accomplishments have been made in the history of academic biblical criticism?
That's a big question. I think we've made clear progress in the acquisition of relevant information, of data that greatly enriches our understanding of the languages of the Bible themselves, of the culture. I mean, it's been a gold mine, a wonderful success in the last couple of 100 years. In some cases, we've refined techniques that help us do things like establish what the text itself might have been with greater accuracy. Sometimes historical critics really just change the question, but in ways that are fruitful. So we're interested in things that our predecessors in earlier centuries sometimes were not. And some of those questions are very important. At the same time, I think it's clear we can say at this point that progress in the study of the Bible is not linear. That is, it's not always just getting better, and it's not inevitable.
So even regress is possible.
There could be, right. Yeah, we can regress as well. For example, if you dig into the history of scholarship, amnesia is a problem. I mean, sometimes, there are things that say good 19th century scholars knew that then people in the 20th century forgot. There are also examples, I think, I would argue, of new problems, distortions that are introduced by historians, for example. I mean, and this isn't surprising when you think about it. New biases. For example, there's always been a problem in Christianity with anti-Judaism, but there have been times in the history of biblical scholarship when that anti-Judaism grew and took on greater significance and played a serious role in distorting our understanding of biblical texts.
Thank you. Friends, if you like this episode, you'll want to listen to our next episode on Mining Scripture, which addresses the question of critical scholarship in regard to the Quran. So we'll move on to the Islamic Holy Scripture. Please spread the news about Mining Scripture. Don't forget to rate, and also, why not add a review of our podcast, and be sure to join us for our next episode of Mining Scripture, where divine word and human reason meet.